Our first speaker for the day will be actually we'll have a tag team match sort of. We'll have Dr. David Mercker of the University of Tennessee, the Extension Forestry. He works with extension programs where he educates landowners, loggers, professional foresters, youth, and society about sustainable forest management. Sort of what I did for 30 years, so I can sort of cope with that. His background includes 13 years in private consulting forestry in Indiana, followed by employment with the University of Tennessee since 1999. But he's going to be talking about managing for quality white oaks. There's a lot of money in white oaks if you have the right, as we found out in the Cooperage plant yesterday. So David will touch base on that. Also in this subject will be managing for quality hardwoods will be Dr. Kelly Schweitzer. Dr. Schweitzer is a research forester at the Southern Research Station, U.S. Forest Service, based in Huntsville, Alabama. Her current research focuses on the ecological role of disturbance in hardwood forest ecosystems of the Cumberland Plateau and associated highlands, including prescribed fire. So without further ado, Kelly, Doctor, y'all come right ahead. Come ahead, David.
Good morning, y'all. Our daughter is married, and she has two little boys. One is 4 and one is 2. What one doesn't think of, the other will. Now, did I mention they are 4 and 2? Last autumn, she decided to take the boys on a trip to go visit their great-grandparents. And on the way back, they stopped at a Cracker Barrel. And after eating, she decided that they should use the restroom before they struck back out on the road. And so the 4 and 2-year-old couldn't use the men's restroom. They had to go into the ladies' restroom with their mother. And after finishing up, they were washing up, and suddenly the door of the bathroom burst open. And a lady frantically came running into the restroom, and she sees the boys, and she thinks she's gone into the wrong bathroom. Upon seeing my daughter, she realized she hadn't, and she says, "I'm just saying that I'm really sorry for what's about to happen." And she walked into a stall and closed the door. To which the 4-year-old said, "Well, you don't see that every day." And after repeating that about 3 or 4 times, she was finally able to usher him out of the restroom. I thought of those words today because the opportunity to share the stage with Dr. Kelly Schweitzer is something that you don't see every day. Two people that love trees and love the forest and love to teach about it. So it is an honor to be here in Alabama. I enjoy coming down here on a regular basis. You all have got a couple things down right. You've got forestry down and you've got football down. So we do thank you for sending your defensive coordinator up our way. So, let's go ahead and jump into this. And I'd like to begin with what I call the standard. This is the standard of white oaks. And later on I'll be defining for you what the standard is. But this is what it looks like. But in order to get this, if this is your goal, it takes a long time. It takes a lot of patience. There are over 600 different species of white oak in the world. Over 600 different species. But there's only one true white oak, Quercus alba. And we have it. This is where its natural range is. Occupied about 40% of the eastern part of the United States. And just because it's in these states doesn't mean that it's abundant. When we look at the frequency of it, the concentration, that's what the concentration looks like. We're sitting, I think, right about there today. And so as you examine that, there are parts of the country where white oak is more common than what we have here. For instance, look at Missouri. But even in Missouri, those sites are really poor. We can grow it faster. We have longer growing seasons, and we certainly have better soils than the stones they have in the southern part of Missouri. So we're blessed that we have white oak in our region. Now then, it can get a little bit confusing when we talk about oaks. As I mentioned, there's over 600 species that are found in the world, but and most of you probably understand the terms red oak and white oak. You might understand those are actually groups of trees. Groups of trees. So, by the way, I meant to ask you to get started, are there any foresters in the room? Would you raise your hand if there's any foresters? Okay, I'm calling you the preachers because the job of a preacher is to keep you straight. And so you are going to keep Dr. Schweitzer and I straight. But at any rate, one of the characteristics for red oak, of course, is that it has bristle tips right there. And so it looks like a long whisker on the end of the lobes. There are exceptions to that. Willow oak and water oak don't always have that bristle on the tip, but by and large, red oak do. White oak don't. It's missing in the white oak. And so, of the various species of the red oak and white oak group, in our area, there are 44 different red oaks, in the United States, 34 different white oak, and in our region, it's broken down into 12 and 8. So we've got 12 native red oaks in our area, about 8 native white oaks, and so we're going to concentrate on that right there, the 8 native white oaks. Half of them are upland white oaks, and half of them are bottomland white oaks. So let's look briefly at the 4 upland white oaks, and we begin with true white oak, true Quercus alba, the true white oak. And there's really none other quite like it. If you look at the shape of its leaf, I'll point out what I call the brief recognizable features. In other words, briefs. I'll point out some briefs for each of these species. And you see white oak has the very long, slender lobes. That's the brief for white oak, indistinguishable. The other species that's very similar in wood quality to white oak is the chinkapin oak. Right here. Now what you notice about the chinkapin oak is that it has smaller lobes. And there are 3 different white oaks that have small lobes like this, but this is the only one where they actually kind of bend forward. You notice those lobes kind of bend forward and they have a point on the end. Not a bristle tip, but they are pointed at the end. I'm told by the Gingrich folks that this species will substitute for true Quercus alba, true white oak in the cooperage industry. The other thing that stands out, maybe difficult to see in this light, but the bark of chinkapin oak has kind of a creamy color. And the others, whereas the others are more of a gray color, this one stands out in the woods anyway because you see that cream color to it. The other 2 upland white oaks include the post oak, and the brief for post oak is the fact that it has very square lobes. It's also a thick leaf that has a waxy cuticle on it, which helps it. That's why it can tolerate dry sites so well. But post oak, the thing that stands out with regard to its bark, and anybody in the cooperage business knows this, is that it tends to have a blotchiness. If you look at the bark, can you see the patch in it right there? Let's back that up. Can you kind of see the difference between the bark up here and down here and that patch in the middle? Post oak is notorious for that patchwork in the bark. Chestnut oak is the final upland oak, somewhat similar to the chinkapin oak in that it has small lobes, but it's a wider leaf and the lobes are shallower. The bark is indistinguishable too, but the acorns as well. If you're dealing with a large acorn on an upland site, that's probably your chestnut oak, Quercus saprinus. We turn now to the bottomland oaks, the bottomland white oaks, and swamp white oak. Notorious, what it's known for is the underside of the leaf. It has a white pubescence to it, and also if you look at the stalk of the acorn, notice how long that stalk is. It's 2 inches in length. None others quite like that. And then the overcup oak, the briefs for it include a very V-shaped base, as well as the cap of the acorn encapsulates the acorn itself, and hence the name overcup oak. And then finally, we've got a bur oak, not very common in our region. Deep sinuses, the center part of the leaf, but then of course the acorn itself, the cap, has hairs on the fringe. It's the size of a walnut. It's a huge acorn. And then swamp chestnut oak. Not much to be said about it other than the fact it looks like chestnut. If you find a tree that looks like chestnut growing in the bottomlands, it's swamp chestnut. The natives would call it, and in the industry they call it cow oak. So, complicating matters a little bit more, the true white oak, Quercus alba, the bark pattern can be quite varied. From a scaliness to more of a corky bark pattern, and I don't know why that is. Perhaps Callie has run across that in her studies, but I don't know why that is. So the question at this point is, why the current prominence? Why is everybody so interested in white oak? It's been around for a long time. It's always in demand, a species that was in high demand, but basically what it comes down to is the Asians are tired of drinking sake. That's really what it comes down to. They've discovered dark bourbon, and Southeast Asia is buying this as fast as they can. We have a cooperage mill right outside where I'm located in Jackson. They are expanding. They've doubled their starting salary from $8 an hour to $16 an hour, offering 401ks and health insurance plans, and they're building. I'm going to hire 20 more people this summer, so it's here to stay, I think. Of course, Bourbon then is run by what you discovered yesterday, and that's the barrels. And of course we know that barrels rely heavily on one species primarily, and that's Quercus alba, the white oak. And the reason for that is these. Maybe yesterday they told you a little bit about tyloses. White oak has vessels, as do all hardwood trees, and this is what carries the water from the roots of the tree, the water nutrients from the roots up to the limbs and leaves, so that photosynthesis can be carried out. So that's like a conduit of water. But tyloses are these outgrowths that plug the vessels that prevent water from moving up through the tree, and they form very quickly. I've been told by our wood product specialists that just within about 3 or 4 years, these tyloses begin forming. So the sapwood begins plugging pretty quickly. And so that would be a tyloses that is actually plugged right there. And that prevents the barrel from leaking. Now, other species have tyloses. Black locust is an example. As is mulberry, as is poplar. Tulip poplar have tyloses. But I'm sure Cooper's Mills can't find enough black locust and mulberry to run a mill with, and apparently poplar bourbon doesn't taste like white oak bourbon, so that's why we focus on white oak. Now, because of what's happening, what I've done here is I've plotted lumber prices for 2 species over a 13-year period, and this is number 1 common 4-quarter. Think of that as just normal boards, not prime and not duds, but normal boards. And over the 13-year period, you see that white oak in blue and poplar in red kind of patterned each other. Poplar was about 60% the price of white oak. And along about right in here, that began to change. And you see poplar straight line, in fact, has come down since then. But white oak has gone through a period where, after the recession, it rebounded strongly, over surplus occurred and caused it to come down again, and now it's off and running again. So you see a divergence of these 2 species. Now, why else is white oak important? The wildlife biologists will tell you it's because of this right here. The acorn, of course. We know that they're very important for wildlife, so I posed the question to Dr. Craig Harper. He's our wildlife specialist. Perhaps you've heard of him before. He's an expert in this field. And I said, Dr. Harper, does wildlife prefer Quercus alba, white oak, acorns over red oak? Of course, we know they do. But then I wanted to know, but even other species of white oak. So does wildlife prefer true Quercus alba over these other 7 species that we've covered? And true to Craig's form, this is his answer. In other words, who cares? Just have oak in your woods, and the more diverse the better, because the acorns will fall at different times, and we know that red oak take 2 years to mature their acorns, white oak 1 year, so have it all, in other words. Let's get back to the original title slide here, Managing for Quality White Oaks, and begin to delve into that a little bit. And I begin with the long word silviculture. We learn in grade school that if you don't know the meaning of a word, you break it down into its parts. So we see the word silva, which is a Swedish word that means forest, trees. We see the word culture, which means controlling the growth of something. So we are controlling the growth of forest trees. A number of years ago, we had a music minister come to our church from California. And after a couple of years, I was speaking with him, and I said, "How do you like West Tennessee?" He said, "Oh, it's fine," but he said, "There's no culture here." He said, "I beg to differ. We have plenty of agriculture, and we've got silviculture, and we've got aquaculture and horticulture." I don't think that's the kind of culture he's looking for. Silviculture, controlling the growth of forest trees. So I want to break down to you some of the silvical characteristics of white oaks that make it both a challenge and a blessing, I suppose, to try to grow. We begin with seed dissemination. You've heard it said the nut doesn't fall far from the tree. Although an acorn isn't a nut, it's an acorn. It's true that other than gravity, acorns don't spread much. We know that blue jays carry a lot around and disperse them, but for the most part, they're going to fall there, and that's where they're going to land. And so that makes it a little bit of a challenge. Regarding seed dormancy, the white oak acorn germinates immediately. If you've ever been deer hunting in the fall, and the deer aren't moving, and you look down on the ground, and you're just bored, essentially, you can notice the white oak acorns, and the little radical, the little root is beginning to protrude. Red oaks don't do that. They have to go through a period of stratification, of cold snap, in other words. So that makes them unique too. Thirdly, ecological strategy. They are conservative, meaning they are slow starters as opposed to exploitative. So when we have a big splash of sunlight coming down into the forest floor from harvesting or a wind throw or whatever, some species like poplar will regenerate quickly, as will perhaps sweet gum, and if your bottoms, it might be black willow, something like that. Oak is not like that. They're very conservative, slow starters. So it's the tortoise and the hare approach. Regarding longevity, they are long-lived. Of course, we know that. Now, later on, I'm going to focus a little bit more on this one right here, because that's very important when you understand, when you're trying to practice good silviculture with white oak, they are very drought tolerant. So that can be a good thing. And also regarding shade tolerance, they're considered intermediate, which means they can tolerate some shade, but sometime over the course of a day during the growing season, they need a direct shot of sunlight to really survive and thrive. Continuing with this, a few more points to make is that white oaks are very good stump sprouters, particularly 2 to 5 inch stumps, and 5 to 11 inch stumps are considered good. Beyond that, it's kind of marginal. As you can imagine, a stump this size, if it's tree's been cut down, has a massive root system, and it's not likely that those sprouts can produce enough carbohydrates, enough energy, enough sugar to feed the roots. So they just don't do well beyond about 12 inches inside. Regarding the genetics, of course they are wind pollinated. They have male and female flowers on the same tree, and so there's a lot of cross-pollination that goes on. Acorn production is heavily determined upon spring weather. And I'm a little bit concerned about this spring's weather. Not only has it been chilly, but it's been wet. And so rather than pollen floating around like it's supposed to, it just runs off the tree. And so that, but at any rate, the genetics is mixed up because assuming you have plenty of white oaks, they can cross. They do hybridize with other white oaks. So that can be a little bit of a challenge. It's not very common though. So the white oak, the true white oak, Quercus alba, can cross with all 7 of those other white oaks that we had, that we've covered. So again, not very common. And then finally, fire tolerance. They are moderately resistant. That increases with age as the bark thickens. Now, addressing a little bit about their site requirements, white oak can grow on a variety of sites. That's what makes them so good. From the rich uplands to the well-drained bottomlands to the gravelly slopes. And they'll grow on all aspects as well. Aspect refers to the direction the slope faces. So we'll see them on north, south, east, west facing slopes. And even the slope position, meaning on the top of the hill, the side of the hill, or the bottom of the hill. So they'll grow in essentially all these types of areas. They may not grow well there though, because of competition. The better the site becomes, of course, the more everything wants to grow on a good site. And then often they are found on pure stands or on drier sites. That's where we tend to find the pure stands of them. Now I pause a moment here because, and I don't have the numbers down exactly, but there's statistics that show something like the fact that you're going to forget half of what I've told you within the next hour. It's true. And by this time tomorrow, you're going to forget 80% of what I tell you. Which is kind of discouraging to a speaker, really. We spend a lot of time and think that 80% of it's going to be gone within a day's time. But research has also shown that you're more likely to remember it if we give you a picture. So this is one of the take-home visuals. This is one of the take-home visuals that I want you to remember. It's busy, but this is really fascinating. Okay, what we've got is the competitiveness of various tree species based on soil moisture. So we've got a continuum here of a dry site to a wet site. You with me? Dry site to wet site. This is just relative. And on the y-axis, we've got competitiveness. You see it goes from 0 to nothing. So it basically means nothing, other than the fact that up means more competitive. All right? So take a gander at tulip poplar or yellow poplar and look at the competitiveness of it. You with me? Yellow poplar is a species that grows very, very well on the best of sites, the mesic sites, the ones that are neither decidedly too dry or too wet. It's very competitive there. Beyond that, though, it falls off rapidly. The next one, sweet gum. It also has a bell-shaped curve, but it's a flattened bell and a broadened bell. So it can obviously tolerate a little bit more dry sites than poplar and a little bit more wet sites. I think you probably will find that your native, that the species that you're very familiar with, loblolly pine, would probably follow a similar pattern as sweet gum. Now let's take a look at white oak. Study that for a second. It cannot tolerate wet feet at all. It can tolerate a lot of drought. So when white oak and sweet gum are growing together, sweet gum is going to dominate that section right there. It's hard for white oak to compete on that side. Poplar is actually going to outperform both of them on that type of site. And where white oak is strongest is right here. It's going to outcompete the poplar and the sweet gum and many other species right here in sites that are marginally dry. Now, it doesn't mean that white oak doesn't want to grow here. As I said earlier, everything wants to grow here. That's part of the problem. And it just can't compete as rapidly. So, and it doesn't also mean that we shouldn't try to grow trees on this site. We should, but management intensity is going to increase as site productivity increases. So you're going to have to do a lot more work to ensure the survival and the thriving of white oak on those sites. Take home visual number one. Now, silviculture is accomplished in 3 different phases. There is the establishment phase, the intermediate operations, and the harvest. So I liken these to legs of a triangle. You can compare this to your garden. We establish the garden, we manage the garden, and then we reap the benefits. We harvest from the garden. Most people would call that regeneration, but I've changed the name to harvest today. So people get excited about planting trees and establishing a forest, don't you? And likewise, people get very excited about this phase right here, harvesting. That's when the money's being made. Oftentimes, this is the one that's overlooked, intermediate operations. What are you doing to that garden, to that forest, as it is growing? So I'll briefly touch on some white oak techniques for management in each of these stages. All of this, scientists have made careers out of studying just one aspect of it. So there's so much to know, far more than what can be covered here today. So we'll look at the white oak establishment. White oak can be established a couple different ways. We can plant them, artificial regeneration, or it can be natural regeneration. So within the planted, it can be in field settings or in woodland settings. So let's talk a little bit about planting of white oak and a few things for you to consider. And we begin with field settings. Site preparation is essential. You're looking at a 120-acre field that we planted to 14 different species of oak in 2004. Site preparation is essential, so you're going to be studying the noxious weeds that might give you fits, fertility as well. One of the things that I highly encourage is the subsoiling if it's going to be in field settings, because these fields have been farmed many times for decades or even pastured for centuries. And there's a hard pan quite often just below the surface of the soil. And so the fall before spring planting, take an 18-inch shank and pull it behind the tractor and bust that soil up, allowing the root to penetrate the soil. And then just go right down the row when you're planting the trees. I'm a believer in mixed plantings. I don't like monocultures. I know in loblolly pine, that's something that you do, but in hardwoods, it doesn't work very well. I like mixed plantings. And so, for instance, if I'm trying to favor white oak, I really want no more than about 25% of the species to be true white oak. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. We're dealing with a crop that's going to take many, many, many decades to mature, unlike your southern pine. And so you never know what's going to happen over the course of the next 70, 80 years. And so diversity is a good thing, so I encourage you to have plenty of different oaks, just as Dr. Harper suggested, different species of oak. And I like mixing trainers in with it. And what I mean by that is something that's a little bit faster growing that can sort of compete with your desired trees, but not at the rate that they're going to kill them. So some examples might be loblolly pine. I've got some work going where We've got loblolly pine as trainers. I've seen it with yellow poplar. I've seen it with cottonwood. I've seen it with river birds and sycamore. A number of species that can be used, but these are fast-growing trees that sort of close the side up quickly, and they need to be thinned out early on because of that reason. We begin with large diameter seedlings, and I'm not saying tall seedlings. Tall seedlings can be good, but more important is the diameter of the caliper, where the root meets the top. In other words, at the soil line. That's an indication of energy reserves in the roots. And regarding the roots, we like to see a lot of lateral roots, not just a stick sticking in the ground, but lateral roots that come off of that too. There's plenty of research that tells you the number of lateral roots and so forth, but big bases to the trees is important. A maximum of 10 by 10 spacing, that's 435 trees per acre. Broader than that is fine, other than the fact that the stand doesn't close up very quickly. The side branches don't shade off as early as they should, and so you might end up with limby trees someday. Tighter than that is preferred. I like really, ideally, about an 8 by 10 for hardwood trees. The more the better. It tends to force them up. But if there's too many, of course, then you have to thin them out pre-commercially at an expense. And then you can't say enough about herbaceous weed control for the first 3 years. I like 3 years of spraying and 3 years of mowing. And then once the heads get above the weeds, you can turn them loose. Field settings. We can plant trees in woodland settings too. I've seen more failures than successes, though, in this, and I've done a lot of it and have been disappointed many times. So it can be done. Site preparation, again, is essential. Essentially what you're doing is you're planting oak seedlings back into openings that have been created from the harvest. The openings can be anywhere from preferably about an acre and a quarter in size and larger in order to get the adequate sunlight down. But site preparation involves killing residual trees that were left in the openings, plus the woody competition. It's a lot of work. It can be a lot of work, and even coming back the next couple of years, because again, everything wants to flood this new opening that you've created, and so you've got to deal with that. You're talking about pure plantings. Really, you're only planting about 70 trees per acre on a 25 by 25 foot spacings. Again, they need to be really big seedlings on something like this, because oftentimes research has shown, I've seen Dr. Stringer's work and others, that if poplar seed source is present, it will outgrow basically anything you want to plant. And so they need to be big seedlings. And woody weed control continues. What you're looking at here is a woodland planting that Dr. Houston has done in West Tennessee. Look at the size of the seedlings. Those are 1-year-old seedlings. And this is what that site looks like 8 years later. And they've thinned out, eliminated all this understory competition for the purpose of field day so that people can get around and look at it and walk through it. But behind Dr. Houston is what it looked like before they cleaned it out. So it's difficult to get something to grow up in that type of environment, particularly if it's fast growing. So just to say a word about natural regeneration, I think Dr. Schweitzer will touch on this. He's certainly far more experienced with it than I am. Just a word or two on that. Natural regeneration, in other words, these are seedlings that seeded naturally. You haven't planted the trees. Prior to harvest, it's very important to have advanced regeneration, and again, the taller the better. About 4.5 feet is what foresters tend to indicate. Because without that, again, something like poplar or sweet gum can easily outgrow it. So the taller the better. If there is no advanced regeneration, there are some techniques that can be used to try to encourage the production of oak before you remove the overstory. Such things as prescribed burning and thinning to release some sunlight to allow for the acorns to germinate and get started. And finally, and this might sound comical, but a hot piece of lead traveling at 200 or 2,900 feet per second sometimes is part of the site preparation. In other words, if you've got a high deer population or wild turkey or hogs or squirrels or anything that eats acorns, you might need to control that as part of the site preparation, because they're going to want to eat the acorns that you're trying to grow. A word or two now on intermediate operations. This is that middle part. In other words, you plant the garden, now you've got to tend the garden. We are tending the garden here. And broadly, a couple things that you should consider is that continue to favor the best trees. those with the best form and the best grades. We're talking about white oak. Just because it's a white oak doesn't mean it's a desirable white oak. We want those with good form and good grade, which I'll define for you shortly. Secondly, as the stand develops, we've got to maintain proper stocking. So stocking is a measure of the growing space. Anybody in here raise cattle? We have any cattle farmers in here? Got some cattle farmers? They tell me that the proper stocking for livestock is about 1 head per acre. Is that about right? 1 head per acre. That's a stocking level that doesn't change through time. It doesn't really matter what size cow you've got out there, about 1 head per acre. And the same is true with our row crops. I ask our row crop scientists, how many kernels of corn do you plant per acre? And they'll say about 25,000 per acre. And that's exactly what's there when you harvest it at the end of the growing season. A few of them might have died out. But the stocking level doesn't change. Forestry is different. Our stocking level changes as it develops. So we begin with hundreds and oftentimes thousands and thousands of seedlings per acre. And as this stand develops through time, we have to thin it or it will thin itself. You do the same thing with your loblolly pine. So let me show you another series of visuals to help explain this whole stocking situation. Begin with the Gingrich stocking chart. Now this is pretty deep. It's not for you to memorize. The foresters in here recognize this chart. But some points can be made here that are important. Across this bottom axis, we see the number of trees per acre. And across the side is basal area, which I won't go into, and the percent stocking and the average tree diameter. So as your white oak stand develops, it might grow into this condition. It gets to the point of what we call overstock. We know when overstocking occurs, growth rate is going to be suppressed. Some trees are going to die. You're losing money on your investment at that point. And so foresters might thin the stand out and bring it down to a more appropriate level of fully stocked. So we've gone from whatever that reads, about 300 trees per acre down to about 225 trees per acre. We don't want to drop the stocking too low because that's when the trees are going to bush out like a yard tree. We don't want too much sunlight, we want just enough. And white oak are notorious for forming branches on the side, epicormic sprouts, if they get too much sunlight. So we probably don't want to drop that stocking down below about 70%. Look at it a different way. Think of it this way. We begin with a young forest. Let's say it's a 10 by 10 spacing with 435 trees per acre. And we say that it is fully stocked. When they're young, little bitty seedlings, that's fully stocked. But of course, we know it's going to grow. And as it grows, it becomes overstocked. Now, we can do nothing at that point and allow the forest to essentially thin itself, which can take years and years to do, or we can thin it. Now, at this point, it would be pre-commercial thinning, most likely. We're probably not going to have markets for some of these small trees, but we thin it out and we've created the growing space again. You can hear a sigh of relief amongst the trees. I love personifying trees. You know they do sigh, right? But again, at this point, we say it is fully stocked, but it is going to grow again and become overstocked. You see how the stocking kind of pulsates back and forth, unlike livestock in a field. So we thin it out again. And we say it's fully stocked and then becomes overstocked as it grows again. Now we're reaching small, soft timber. Each time we go through this, the tree's naturally getting bigger, the product class is more valuable, and we're continually pushing the best trees forward because we're thinning out what I'm going to define for you shortly. We're thinning out the D trees. The D trees. Notice what's happening to the number of trees, though. We've gone from 435 down to 100. So we thin it out again, and then it grows again. We've gone from all the way down to about 35 to 50 trees per acre until such point that once it gets fully stocked again, we regenerate it. We start it over. So with pine, it's typically thin, thin, clear cut. With hardwoods, it's typically thin, 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 clear cut. Well, harvesting. Harvesting these trees, I just briefly want to touch on some harvest methods or techniques that can encourage white oak regeneration. What we don't want to do, though, is what we call diameter limit cutting. And this, unfortunately, at least in Tennessee, is the most common way that hardwood trees are harvested. Diameter limit cutting. And what we mean by that is the harvesting of all trees above a specified diameter. So I have landowners come to me quite often, very excited. They say, we cut some trees and we cut them 16 inches and bigger. And you cringe when you hear that, knowing that it's not the right practice. And I want to add to it, it's the indiscriminate practice of harvesting all trees that are 16. In other words, let's harvest them just because they're of size, with no consideration to the investment potential of that tree. So, here's another one of the visuals that I want you to take home. What we've got is what diameter limit looks from a graph point of view. And across our two axes, we have tree value and we have size. So consider this. We've got 12-inch diameter trees, 22 and 32. What diameter limit cutting is eliminating all that. The red line is the value increase, so it's this sigmoid curve. And so it's increasing exponentially at an increasing rate right here. Why would you ever want to cut a tree at 16 inches if it has the potential to become that at 22 inches? You wouldn't, unless you're either desperate or just ill-informed. Now, I've selected 22 inches. It doesn't mean that all white oak mature financially at 22 inches. It depends on the site. So if you look at the economic maturity, generally I say that on poor sites, white oak are going to mature out at about 18 inches in diameter, give or take. On average sites, about 22 inches, give or take. And on good sites, about 26 inches, give or take. So not all sites are the same, so just blindly saying we're going to take them 16 inches in diameter is really a poor financial decision in many cases. Now what we don't want to do in the process of harvesting is leave the D trees. The damaged, the defective, the diseased, dwarf, doty, dogs, duds, dastardly, and otherwise undesirables. That's called high grading, which means taking the best and leaving the rest. That's not an acceptable hardwood management practice. Now, why does it happen? Why does diameter limit cutting happen? Basically what it comes down to is high initial revenue. If you just purchase the property and you need the money back, you're going to cut it. So I fall short of calling it greed, but I will call it impatience. I will call it impatience. So let's take, for instance, this happens to be a red oak, but the story is true of white oak. This is an actual example. This is a 16-inch diameter red oak. So at chest height, 16 inches in diameter, about that big. Presently, that tree has 100 board feet in it, so it's worth about $25. We could cut it for $25, just like you could cut the white oak for $25. Or we could grow it to 22 inches in diameter, at which point it will have 340 board feet, and it will be worth $204. If you do the internal rate of return on that, it takes 18 years to get there, but that's a 12.4% return on investment. That's tax shelter. It's growing every year, you're not paying taxes on it. When you do sell it, you have the advantage of capital gains. So why would you want to cash that investment in with that kind of return on investments? Now some of you are saying, is that even possible? Yeah, it is. And here's how it can be possible. How can a tree grow or increase in value eight times in only 18 years? 3 ways. We know that we've got growth in diameter. What you see here are annual growth rings. What I see is interest rate. That's interest rate on your asset, right? Now we know that trees produce food through the process of photosynthesis, but what you may not know is how they allocate that sugar, that food, once they produce it. The very first sugars that are produced go toward respiration, so they have to keep the living cells alive, no different than us. So food has to go to keep that. If there's any energy left over, then it goes to the fine root production. You know what I'm talking about, those hair roots. Dug through the flower bed and seen tree roots. They last about 2 or 3 years and then they die off. But they're the drones, those are worker bees. Those are the ones that are procuring water and nutrients. It's critical, so a lot of energy goes into that. If there's any energy left over after all that, then the tree puts it into flower and seed production. If you ask most self-respecting deer why they like the acorn, it's because that's where the carbohydrates are, right? So there's a lot of energy in fruit and flower production. If there's any sugar or energy left over after all that, it then goes into what we call primary production, which is the expansion of the crown and the expansion of the roots. So the tree is saying, life's plush, everything's taken care of, we can now afford to go grab a new piece of sky and a new piece of earth. Let's expand. No different than when you and I get a raise. See, I can afford that car now, right? That's what they're doing. Now at this point, you notice no wood has been produced. So if any energy is left over after all this, it finally goes to secondary production, which is the growth rings right here. So how can a tree increase in value that much in only 18 years? Number one, by growth in diameter. Number two, by growth in log length. So while the tree is growing in diameter, it also has the opportunity to increase in height as well. So we'll go back to our red oak, and as it stands right now, we're looking, that's where that log is going to be cut off. Two 16-foot logs. Beyond that is pulpwood. It doesn't have the diameter that hardwood mills are looking for. But in time, given another 18 years, that upper log is also going to be added to it. So we've grown this way and we've grown this way. And boy, that really increases the value of trees quickly. And then finally, over an 18-year period, you might see some improvement of grade. So where a limb has fallen off, a scar is left. By the way, trees never heal. They just hide their wounds. And that's what this one is doing. They just hide their wounds. So the first year's growth is there, second year's there, third year's there, fourth. By the fifth year, it's finally sealed off, and by the sixth year, it's just a bump on a log. So all this wood from here forward is going to be good, clean lumber. Might have a distortion, a little bit of a grain pattern, but that's going to be worth more. Clean lumber is worth more. So yes, it's possible for trees to have that kind of return on investment if you leave those 16 inches. Now, when you're choosing your harvest methods, we want to choose harvest methods that let the light in. Dr. Schweitzer can address this much greater detail than I can. But three methods that are common, at least can encourage the reproduction of white oak, would be the clear cut, group selection, and shelter wood. We know what a clear cut is. You might not know what a shelter wood is, but that's really a two-stage clear cut where we eliminate some of the trees, leaving those that have good acorn production and maybe better genetics until such time that they're the parents of the offspring that finally get started. You might combine something like that with fire. It might increase the reproduction of white oak. And then finally there are group selection, which is something that I'm kind of fond of, and that's small clear cuts. Small clear cuts, more palatable to the eye. That's Roy Ward. He is manager of the West Tennessee State Forest, and that was his first clear cut. And of it, he said it was big, it was ugly, and it was mine. Foresters learn about clear cutting in school, but there's nothing like a paint can in hand and you create one. And he had created one. You notice that stump and that sprout, and you notice that forester. And I want you to watch something about this clear cut. The forest is resilient. The forest is resilient. The forest is resilient. You stop mowing your lawn, and you'll have a forest someday. So regeneration can be a tool for achieving forest sustainability, including the regrowth of white oak in many cases. Well, regarding tree form and grade, I told you I would come back to that. They do affect price. Form refers to the relative straightness, so we like straight trees, naturally. Grade refers to the number and the types of defects. Highly affects the value of trees. So forest management can affect both of these to a certain extent. When we talk about defects, basically, we must first establish the standard. Remember the very first slide I showed with the twin white oaks, and I said that's the standard? I'll let you read what the standard. What is the perfect white oak log? There are over 40 different defects that are recognized in hardwood logs. We've got a webinar that's coming out this summer that addresses all those different defects. Stay tuned on that. But defects can either be defects on the surface of the log that are visible, so while the tree is still standing, you can clearly see that these are defects, but sometimes they're only apparent after the tree's been cut down. Those are interior defects. Those are the ones that sting the timber buyers sometimes. They didn't realize that the stain was in these trees. I just want to give you a few examples of some of the more common defects. So we have bulge. These are the D trees that you want to thin out as the forest is developing. So take this D tree out and leave this crop tree for the future. Bulge is an example. We've got a whole host of knots and bumps that affect largely, oftentimes these are old limbs that have swollen, but it could also be from another kind of damage. An insect could cause this in some cases, an overgrowth like that. Epicormic branches, we know that those are sprouts that flush periodically. We've got to watch that. I mentioned earlier, we've got to time the timing of white oak thinnings properly, and we don't want to over-thin because it can encourage the production of epicormic branches. So it is both an art and a science. Of course, bird peck, borers, stains and streaks, pinworm, holes. Foresters are pretty good at being able to assess the likelihood of defects in trees just by observing the clues that the forest tells us. And so this is just some examples that as I walk into a forest, if I see this type of forest, I know we're headed toward a lot of defects in the trees. We begin with poor sites. If there's a history of past fire, that could be damaging, as well as pasturing. Livestock pasturing, over-pasturing particularly exposes the roots, and that leads to a number of defects. Over-maturity, broken tops, open wounds, and then just irregular bark patterns. Well, here's the take-home message for my presentation, and that is as follows. Regarding the management of white oak, things to consider, as I stress, start with bigger seedlings, whether or not they're being planted or if they're being released. Bigger is better, size matters. Provide adequate sunlight through the whole process, but especially when the seedlings are young, so you've got to control competition. As well, select desired crop trees early, so identify those gems, those jewels, those ones that you want to push forward into the future that are going to be your crop trees, and follow them through time and release them properly and carefully. Again, careful not to over-thin. And then management intensity is kind of stressed. It increases as the site quality increases too. So you're going to spend more on those good sites in order to keep the poplar and sweet gum at bay and other species that might be competitors. And then finally, see professional foresters throughout the process. 6 weeks ago, Lee Lackiel contacted me. He said, "David, do you believe in free speech?" And I said, "Sure, I believe in free speech." He said, "Good, come get one." I have given you my free speech. I hope that the 20% that you're going to retain tomorrow will benefit you in some form or another, and I'll just leave you with that.
What kind of herbicide?
The question is, what kind of herbicide do you use? Okay, and it depends on what stage. I assume you mean in establishing the trees or in killing it. Okay. Generally, there's a number that could be used, but the one that I found is most effective has been OUST, O-U-S-T, at about 2 ounces per acre is all it takes, and it won't kill the trees. There are others that you can use, but you might have to direct them on the side, not to hit the leaves.
You can spray over it.
You can spray over. I prefer to spray before bud break because I've seen it kind of twist and curl the leaves sometimes. But OUST doesn't last that long. It does leach out and break down, and so. But it's good coverage through early spring, which is important. Late season weeds don't bother me that much in planting. Let them conceal the seedlings a little bit so the deer don't eat them in the winter. Of course, there are herbicides too that are used to girdle trees and kill them later on if you don't have markets. That's timber stand improvement, which is a whole different presentation to give sometime.